Wilson believed in the parliamentary system.
The need to maybe make some alterations to the electoral college and.
To be fair to the founding generation,
Yep.
a parliamentary system of government hadn't been invented yet. So, who were they really kind of looking to? The state of political science was pretty meager back then, right? You had John Locke, you had Baron de Montesquieu, you had Aristotle and Plato, and that was about it, right? And so they did a pretty good job, I think, with what they had. But you're right, especially today, in comparison to other, democratic systems. A lot of people are wondering whether or not we should change the system to kind of, solve some of the problems. But before it seems like you guys are talking about, this first question up here. It's really hard to change the Constitution, right?
Can you imagine a constitutional convention with Twitter and Facebook? I mean, it was bad enough, difficult enough when they're meeting in a secret room in Philadelphia. I mean, every interest group in you might make it better, but there's also a real danger that you could make it a lot worse too.
Well,
it's
almost impossible
is it good
to do.
Yeah.
So, what is required in order to amend the Constitution? Well, you need a 2/3 majority in the House of Representatives, then you need a 2/3 majority in the Senate, and then you need to have it ratified by 3/4 of the states. Now, that requires an amazing amount of consensus, and it was done by design, right? The founding generation, they did not want it to be easy to get things done in government. The whole point of our system of government is to make things hard to pass, right? It's all about dividing power, right? Slowing things down. So democracy is not about efficient lawmaking, right? And so as a political scientist, I sometimes get frustrated when you'll see pundits on TV saying, oh, if only we had someone like a Vladimir Putin to kind of like ram things through. Now that's a leader who can get things done. Well, yeah.
So Hitler.
Yeah, he got things done too. Our system doesn't work for a reason. It's prone to gridlock for a reason. It's because the founding generation kind of recognized that people could be overly passionate, that they could be influenced by a demagogue, so it appeals to people's anger and hatred, and that the best kind of recipe for that was to divide power as much as you could to make it as hard as possible to change things. So that was the kind of overriding goal of why our system looks like it does. And in consequence, nobody looks to our government design and our institutions as models that they want to replicate. There used to be some of that in the 19th century. Our system of government was viewed as the cutting edge and kind of democratic technology, right? And we influenced constitutions throughout the world. But really, starting in the late 20th century, and especially in the 21st century, newly democratizing states, they do not look towards the United States. We have a presidential system of government. They do not look to us as a model. They look to parliamentary systems in Europe. Now, why is that the case? That's the case because in a parliamentary system of government, it's easier for things to get done. So what's the difference between a presidential system and a parliamentary system? When we have a national election, we have individuals run for the office of president, right? And so they promise the world to their constituents, and then they get into office, and then what do they almost always run into as a big problem?
Gridlock.
Why though?
Well, a lot of times you've got a mixed government where you've got a president from one party, but the Congress, the legislative power, is in the hands of the competing party.
Absolutely. And so this contributes to American frustration with government, right? So they have a national election where the president's promising all this great stuff for them, but then we almost always have it as the case that Congress is controlled, at least in whole or in part, by the opposition party. So a president comes into office and then cannot fully implement their agenda, and this creates a lot of frustration. That doesn't happen in a parliamentary system of government. In a national election where you have a parliamentary system, you don't have an individual running for the office of prime minister. It's just the parties running on a platform, and whatever party gets the most votes they get to select who the prime minister is. So that means in a parliamentary system of government, the winning party controls the legislature and the executive. And so when you control the legislature and the executive simultaneously, you can actually implement a good majority of your agenda and deliver to your constituents. But that doesn't happen in a presidential system. You have Congress that is usually controlled by a different party, and then the executive, which is controlled by a different party, right? And nothing gets done. So that, I think, has kind of fed into citizen frustration with democracy, how politicians, they promise the world to everyone, but then it's so difficult for them to kind of follow through. And a great example of this is, you know, look at what's happening to Donald Trump right now. He is in an unusual position where we have a single party controls all the institutions of government, right? The Republicans have a majority in the House of Representatives, they have a majority in the Senate, and they control the executive branch. You should be able to pass the vast majority of your agenda when you have that. Has he?
Well, the repeal and replace sure didn't go very well.
Neither did his executive orders of banning, you know, refugees or entrants from Muslim-majority countries. He's tried that twice now, and that's been jettisoned by the courts. So, you know, our system is not designed to be efficient. What it is designed to do is to enhance the legitimacy of the process, right? And so legitimacy and efficiency are two very different things. And I think that in civics education, not enough emphasis is placed on that. It certainly wasn't in my own kind of education as a political scientist. This was something that I kind of came to myself, that you know, we have a trade-off. We made a trade-off when we designed our system of government, and we decided that the legitimacy of the process was going to be more important than actually getting things done and passing laws. But I don't think Americans kind of fully appreciate, you know, that trade-off. Or we don't have a debate on, do we want that to continue to be the case, or do we need to kind of have serious reforms? Because in the 21st century, you know, we do have a lot of pressing problems. You know, from global trade, cybersecurity, nuclear proliferation, income inequality, climate change, I mean, you name it. There's a lot of big problems that require concerted action, but we don't have a government that is designed to act forcibly, right?
Do these other countries have the same, I guess, cultural divide that we have between, like, these red states and blue states? Like, one thing, if you're a Democratic president, you could win a majority in the whole country and cobble together an electoral majority, but county by county. And if you look at congressional districts, the Republicans have a huge advantage, like disproportionate to the number of actual Republicans, just because of how each state gets a certain number.
That is very, you do not find
Do
that.
other countries have that kind of, like, divide?
They don't. They do have divides, but it's different. So you're referring to kind of like our electoral college system, right? Which privileges, you know, small population states.
And even the House of Representatives does a little bit. Like, you take Nebraska, that's like 3 automatic Republicans, well, 2, I guess, 2 Republican seats. Taken, you know, you can go state by state, but they have an advantage in the House of Representatives as well, disproportionate to their actual strength. Like, if you took the raw numbers, the Democrats would have won more votes. Not that that matters. I understand we're not a.
That's from a quirk of history. It derives, you can trace that directly to the Great Compromise, also known as the Connecticut Compromise, right?
Yeah.
The fact that, you know, in our founding, we were 13 colonies of very different size, right?
Yeah.
And so it was, the reason why we have this is a legacy from that compromise between big and small population states, right? We have a bicameral legislature where, you know, representation amongst the states is totally equal in the Senate. So it doesn't matter if you're Wyoming, which has a population of about 500,000 people, you're gonna get 2 senators. And if you're California, where you have a population of about 38 million people, you're gonna get 2 senators, right? that's the compromise. In the House, we have proportional representation where it's determined by population size, and so California has a lot more, members in the House of Representatives than Wyoming. But what that does is that it gives a massive amount of influence to small population states in the Senate and in the Electoral College. And so, think about the last 2 Republican presidents we've had. Both of them lost the popular vote. They only gained office because of the Electoral College, and that's that legacy that goes back to the compromise, back in the late 18th century. Now, a lot of people are saying that, it made sense in the late 18th century to make that compromise because we wouldn't have had a country if we didn't, right? The small states like New Jersey, Delaware were threatening to make alliances with European powers instead of being dominated by New York and Virginia, right? So the only way we can kind of get everyone on board was to make that compromise of, okay, you'll have equal representation in the Senate, we'll have this Electoral College, which will artificially inflate the value of individual votes. But in the 21st century, it's making less and less sense. So Hillary Clinton, not the most popular person in the world, but nevertheless got more than 2.5 million more votes than Donald Trump, yet she lost the election. This is, again, I think, kind of, it's difficult for Americans to understand, I think, why this is the case. Because we're taught about democracy, right? Whoever has the most votes wins. That's democracy, and this is very undemocratic. It goes to the point that we don't have a pure democracy. We have a democratic republic, and that is very different from a pure democracy, right?
Yeah.
I think,
and I'm for the Electoral College for what it's worth, but I do think that the way the state, it's just really hard no matter who wins to rule, because you have these little individual congressional districts. Had the Democrats won, that probably favors the Republicans, but.
well, I think I read where it's possible for, I can't remember if it's 19 or 21, but let's go with a bigger number. I think it's possible for 21% of the American population to block the will of the other 79% of the American population because of the arrangement in the Senate.
Yeah.
Enough senators represent.
Right, yeah.
They have enough clout, but they only represent, I can't remember, it's 19 votes. Yeah. And they can solve everything. Yeah. That hardly seems to qualify as democracy.
Right, I don't worry about.
It's supposed to facilitate, or the rationale behind this was that it would facilitate compromise, right?
Yeah.
That we wouldn't just have policy that was being made and reflecting the ideas and preferences of urban Americans, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
That there would have to be some type of give and take. And I'm kind of side with you. I'm not a huge fan of the Electoral College, but I'm more worried about what our system would look like without it, right?
We'd have 13 candidates running. I mean, how would you even?
Well, you would have elections that would be dominated by 3 massive media markets, right? All of our elections would be determined by New York City, Chicago, and LA. End of story.
Yeah.
Now, that sounds great to me. I'm from Chicago, but I could understand how that would be massively alienating for a good amount of Americans, and that would do a lot more to kind of polarize us even further than otherwise. And so, one of the reasons for the Electoral College was to make sure that politicians had some incentive to not ignore, smaller population states. Now, you can debate on whether or not they succeeded in that. I mean, I don't think that they have totally. So, it's not New York, LA, and Chicago that are dominating elections, but it is a handful of battleground states that it's unclear to me why Ohio, Florida, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Why is it these 6 states that, if you've noticed, how many times did Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump visit South Dakota? 0, right? And that's the case for the vast majority of the states, right? You did not have these candidates going to, Montana or Maine or Massachusetts or Illinois or any of those places. It's just battleground states. Now, what makes these states so privileged, right? Well, it has to do with, you know, strategy and just like the calculation of,
Yeah.
you know, electoral votes. But it's not, why should 15 states determine our electoral politics when we have 50 states?
It's definitely, they can tweak it, but I do think another reason they made the electoral college was after George Washington, you really had nobody that was a consensus across the country, and every colony might have had a favorite son that they would have run. Like our two-party system in part came about because of the electoral college, because you have to have a majority to win. So I think I don't think I would assume we would have two candidates running today or have a two-party system if it hadn't been for the electoral college. It would probably look a lot different because the Federalists and Republicans were making calculations, how do we get a majority
As the Democrat
in the
Republicans
electoral
back then.
college? Yeah, so. Yeah, I mean, I don't think we would have just two people running. And the only way a popular vote would reasonably work is if somebody's close to 50%. So like, more people voted against Hillary than for. She won 46% of the vote or something. So most Americans preferred some other candidate. It's not like only once has somebody won a majority and then not come out and won the electoral college.
Well, she won more than 2.5 million more votes than Donald Trump.
Right, but not a majority, a plurality of about 2.5.
But you don't need a plurality to win in our system, and that's kind of the point.
Yeah, but I guess it's not, I guess what I'm saying is if a majority didn't vote for it, it's not I guess tremendously bad, or unfair outcome. If everybody knows the rules going in, would it be a democracy if somebody won with 35% of the vote because they got the most votes?
I think the further you get away from a majority,
Yeah.
The more you suffer in terms of legitimacy.
Yeah.
So I think it's pretty clear, you know, if
Yeah.
someone wins 51% of the vote, they
Yeah.
won, right?
Right.
But when it starts to get below 50%, all of a sudden Americans are like,
Yeah.
does that make sense?
A
Yeah,
lot
Jack.
of that is the consequence of who's running too. Cause you could point to the 1992 election.
Mhm. Where there was
With her husband, where Ross Perot
Right.
stole, well, he didn't steal, but I mean, he won
Yeah, he won.
19 million, nearly 20 million votes, none of the electoral votes. Played spoiler, Bill Clinton's elected with, what did he have, with 42%, 43%
Yeah.
of the votes, something like that, well below half.
But that's
well below half.
a great reason for the electoral college, like you
Yeah.
said. But in 1824, there were 5 like realistic candidates that could win. You had Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, William Crawford, and Hugh White, right? I mean, there was like 4 to 5, or Henry Clay.
Henry Clay.
Was in it. There was like 4 to 5 people that like had the clout to win in the electoral college. Jackson got 40% and made a big deal about like losing, even though he got the most votes. Well, he got like 40% of the vote. So it's not like it was some horribly unfair outcome. When John Quincy Adams was chosen in the House of Representatives, 60% of Americans.
But he was
chose
only a
for-
one-term president, and Jackson won in a landslide afterwards.
He did, but it helped that there was only, well, there were 3 candidates that got electoral votes in 32, I think. I think Daniel Webster got some.
Well, that's another kind of interesting artifact of our system. Like, why do we even have a two-party system? Because in most other democracies, you have multiple parties, right?
Because of the electoral college. That's why
Not
we have a
necessarily,
two-party.
we
Well,
can't
it's
just use
mostly
that-
because of the first past the post.
Yeah, so, when you look at districts, like electoral districts, we
Winner
have
take
what
all.
is called a winner-take-all
Yeah.
system, right?
Right.
And that's not the case in other democracies, which have what is called a proportional representation system. Now, that is
Yeah.
based off the idea, it facilitates, first of all, multiple
Yeah.
parties. And it gives an incentive for there to be other parties because you don't have to win a majority in order to get something, right?
Yeah.
So in our system, each one of our congressional districts is a single member district. Whoever wins the most wins it all, right? And so very frequently we have elections in which, the elections are super close. You know, a Democrat will get, you know, 50% and a Republican will get 48%. And those are representative margins for a lot of districts in red and blue states. Now, what that means is that that person who got, you know, 49%, they win everything, right? And the other party, they get nothing. That's demoralizing for a lot of people, right? And so European democracies in particular try to work around that with a proportional multi-member district system. Now, what that means is that, you know, if you, usually they have a threshold that you have to at least get 5% of the vote to get some type of participation. Now, what that does is that it means that, you know, you don't have just one party running away from everything. You have, you know, you have a conservative party, you have a Labor Party, you have a Green Party, you have a tech party, you have a, you know, you have a party for almost every single issue there is. And a lot of people say that that makes sense, right? That all societies are incredibly diverse and that it's unreasonable to expect two parties to kind of represent the full spectrum of interests that are out there in our society, right? And you can see this happening with the Republicans right now. Is it really one party? I mean, you have the Freedom Caucus in Congress. You have, you know, more blue dog conventional Republicans. You have moderate Republicans. It's really, and it's the same way with the Democratic Party as well. These are parties that are umbrella organizations that you could divide into sometimes 3 or 4 different parties in and of themselves. And you would have that if we had a proportional representation system. We would have a Green Party, a Libertarian Party, but we don't because of our winner-take-all system. Now, again, that, you know, we're sacrificing legitimacy for efficiency in this case, right? You know, the virtues of a winner-take-all system is that it's straightforward and simple, right? We have 2 parties, so it's not too complex. But, you know, you alienate a lot of people. I mean, think about all the Ron Paul supporters in the Republican Party who are always on the outside looking in, who never really have a lot of influence within the Republican Party, right? Or think about, you know, the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party. It's the exact same thing, right? You know, they're Democrats, but they never really influence the Democratic agenda. That would change if you had a bunch of different parties that could represent this group. You know, they might not get a controlling stake in government, they might only get 15, 20% of representation, but think about how that would change the calculus of a citizen on going out to vote, right? Instead of like, oh, you know, I'm a Ron Paul Republican, my vote's not gonna count, I'm just gonna stay home, or I'm a Bernie Sanders Democrat, they're not gonna listen to me, this is a Hillary Clinton party, I'm just gonna stay home and vote. If you had a Green Party or a Libertarian Party, though, you would be more likely to go out and vote because you recognize that, yes, I'm not going to have a total control over the agenda or win an entire election, but I will get some representation if we can get to that 5 or 10% threshold. Now, that creates some problems, too. So, you know, Italy is kind of the poster child of how multi-party proportional representation can go terribly wrong, because when you have a whole bunch of parties gain influence, it's kind of the scenario of too many cooks in the kitchen, right? You have to have a coalition government. You have to have a lot of compromise in order to kind of hobble together a government with enough votes to pass laws. And so, you know, when you only have, you know, 4 to 6 political parties, you can work that out. But when you have 20, 30, 40, 50 different political parties, all of a sudden, you know, it gets real messy. And so, you know, Italy back in the 1980s was very famous for, you know, having elections. They would hobble together this grand coalition party, but then it would collapse after only 6 months or so. And that would happen every year. They would have national elections, you know, at least once or sometimes 2 or 3 times every single year, because it was so difficult to get a multi-party coalition to work with each other. But citizens participated. They went out and they voted all the times because they knew that there was a party that was going to represent them. So it was great from a standpoint of getting citizens to be active. It was very bad from the standpoint of actually having a stable government that could do something. So, I mean, there's no pristine bullet to kind of solve any of our problems. You know, when you adopt one system, you take the good and the bad, and there's good and bad associated with all systems.
What's the criteria and responsibility of the Electoral College representatives as far as which Are they penalized if they don't?
I think you're talking about the potential for faithless electors.
Yeah. What-
No, they are not. So
They're not penalized
who are the
in any way.
members of the Electoral College? These are people who are decided by the national parties in the state legislature, right? They're usually prominent members within the party, but they are not obligated to cast their votes as the popular vote went. If they wanted to, they could change their vote, and it has happened a couple times, but again, not in numbers that could switch an election from the popular vote. It's possible to have a faithless elector phenomena, but it has never materialized.
If it was going to, you would have thought this past election
Yes.
would have been.
That's what
So-
well, they talked about it, weren't there a couple states?
Oh, there was
that
a
were-
big push of
Yeah.
people that wanted that to happen,
Yeah.
but it just didn't happen.
Yeah,
There's multiple reasons for the Electoral College. One of them was to make sure that politicians did not totally write off small population states, but probably the biggest motivation for the Electoral College was to stop the rise of a populist demagogue like Donald Trump.
Yeah.
That's what the founding generation was terrified about. They were terrified about a charismatic leader who would, enthrall the population and appeal to their fear and hatred. You got to remember that our founders, they were elites. They were not Democrats. They sided with Aristotle. They thought that democracy was essentially mob rule. That's why they created a democratic republic. These were elites. These were the people who thought that it was the wealthy in society. Those were the people who should represent us in government. Why? Because the idea at the time was that if you are wealthy, that means that you are not going to be using government to enrich yourself because you're already rich, right? That you can be dispassionate because you are independently wealthy. They did not trust American citizens to make informed decisions because most American citizens were not independently wealthy. That means that they were going to try to use government to advance their own individual interest. And so the Electoral College was there to give elites a chance to put the brakes on a candidate who was making an appeal to the general masses of fear and hatred. But that didn't work. It turns out that it has not performed
Partly
as
it's
expected.
the system that's in place. When the Electoral College was first designed, each state decided how they chose the electors. So some states did it in the state legislature. So theoretically, it could be a break on a populist demagogue there. You know what I mean? But how would it work as a break today when pretty much the electors in South Dakota have already been at the convention and agreed that they're going to be electors for Donald? I mean, it was one of those where there was 0% chance that they were going to flip their votes, or at least enough of them that there was gonna make a chance.
Well, I
If
think-
state legislatures were making some of the decisions, then in theory you could flip it. But it seems pretty unlikely, given that every state now votes to.
I think it would just be hard for any elector, even if you
Mhm.
totally, thought that Donald Trump was the worst candidate possible. No one wants to go against the popular or what their constituents in their state voted for, right?
Yeah.
That's dangerous to be kind of to stand athwart, what citizens are saying that they want, even if you think it's wrong.
And it could be principled, like you could say, look, the citizens of my state chose Donald Trump, so I have to honor that and cast my electoral vote.
That's, I think, the
I
calculation
think
that
you
most
can
of them
be
made.
principled as well.
I would agree.
Do they have a problem in these countries with multiple parties of having a really extremist group like fascists gain disproportional influence?
Well, that's been
by-
the concern
Mhm.
in this election year especially. So the Netherlands just had an election and they have a proportional parliamentary system, and they had Geert Wilders, who is kind of the Dutch equivalent to Donald Trump, who is kind of blaming a lot of the problems of Dutch society on Moroccan immigrants and stuff. And he resonated and was resonating a lot with Dutch voters, but he was not able to win a commanding lead within the election. It was actually the liberal conservatives who were able to eke out a win in that. But we're going to have elections coming in France, I believe, in a couple of months, where it
Le
looks
Pen.
like the National Front, led by Marine Le Pen, which is kind of the French equivalent of a populist candidate like Donald Trump, she has the best chance in French history so far for a kind of far-right populist party to win an election. And we're gonna have to pay attention to elections in Germany, which are gonna be happening, I think, in August. Angela Merkel's, center-right party is really suffered in popularity when she made that decision to accept 1 million Syrian refugees, right? And so you have the AfD party, the Alternative for Deutschland, which is kind of a populist equivalent that has been making inroads. So it's possible, but I think that it's even if one of those parties were to win, their influence would be greatly diluted because of the parliamentary nature of the system. The fact that they don't have two parties and that they have multiple parties means that no single party is going to have a commanding enough lead to form a government by themselves. They will have to have some type of coalition government to work with other parties, which will force them to moderate their positions. So even if one of these parties did win, they would have less influence than they might in our type of presidential system.
Okay.
So does the parliamentary system, is the prime minister less powerful than the president in our system?
No, because remember, whoever becomes prime minister is selected by the winning party of the legislature, and so that means that that party controls, the executive and the legislature. But usually they have to have a coalition government, and so that is a moderating, influence on them. So in the UK, the Tories have been in power for a long time, and if they had their way, they would, love to kind of revitalize Thatcherite policies of, strict neoliberal policies. But because they have to share power with the Liberal Democrats, that moderates their positions, brings them, closer to the center than they otherwise would be. That's a good question. It really depends. It depends on, how many parties are there and the percentage of the vote that they're able to get, how many seats in the legislature that they have, because that determines on how many other parties they have to include in their coalition. So the more a party wins as a percentage, the more influence they will have. But a party can still win with, 30-35% of the vote, and that means you're going to have a pretty large coalition. That means you're going to have to do a lot of compromising, as opposed to a scenario in which your party won, 45% of the vote.
How about political strategy there? So like you're managing, the Tory campaign. Do you instruct your voters to, I don't know, maybe they're in I don't know if it's even a district system, but maybe.
It's a multi-district system.
Okay.
So it's not a single member district. There is a district will be represented by more than one person if so long as a party gets.
So maybe you tell them don't vote for a Tory in this district, because otherwise, like, the Liberal Democrats are gonna win. So instead, if you're a member of this, vote for this other party that has much fewer seats, because maybe you're not strong in that district. Like, Republicans aren't gonna get any votes in Berkeley. So maybe you tell people in Berkeley, vote for the Green Party, or something. So that we have, because they're less powerful than is there any of that goes on, or?
Maybe a little, but voters are not that hyper rational, right? I think party ID, no matter where you are, it's tribal to a certain extent, right? So it's going to be really hard for a Republican to vote for a Green Party candidate. It's going to be really hard for a Democrat to vote for a Libertarian candidate, even if it kind of strategically makes sense.
Sure.
Because we like to kind of think of ourselves as Homo economicus, right? The idea that all of our decisions are purely rational and based off of cost-benefit analysis. But how many times have you guys made an impulse purchase at a store? I'm going to guess probably frequently, right? We are not kind of making rational cost-benefit analysis on the things that we buy, and neither do we strictly make cost-benefit analysis when we vote, right? And a great example of that is the fact that Americans, in the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s were really pocketbook voters. When Americans went to the polls, they paid attention to candidates that were discussing issues that affected their jobs, the availability of housing, access to education, you know, access to healthcare, things that affected, you know, their material standing. So there are material issues that deal with, you know, the facts of life, but then there are post-material issues. And these post-material issues have become increasingly prominent for voters in this country. So much so that Americans are increasingly voting against their material self-interest, right? So if you believe that the Second Amendment is the most important amendment in the Constitution and gun ownership is the end-all be-all of you know, what it means to be an American, you're gonna be selecting candidates who are going to talk about that issue and promise you that they're not gonna have any regulation on it, even if they also support policies that are going to take away your health care or limit your access to education, right? You know, think about religiously fervent Christians who believe that an abortion is actually, you know, taking a life. They will vote for a candidate that promises that we are going to end abortion, right? Even if they also support, you know, policies that are gonna, you know, limit their ability to retire in safety or have access to healthcare, right? That increasingly happens. You know, Democratic voters, they will vote for candidates who are going to promise them to protect the environment or to protect LGBTQ rights, even if, you know, that Democratic candidate is also, you know, cozy with Wall Street and going to make, you know, banking deregulation more likely, which is going to expose them to, you know, another financial crisis, you know, 5 years down the line. So Americans are not pocketbook voters. We are increasingly kind of motivated by post-material issues, which leads Americans very frequently to vote against their material interests. I feel like I'm kind of bombarding you guys with information.
No, it's very interesting.
So we've kind of touched on some of these, you know, the first part here, but we still have world affairs and future challenges to talk about. Or if you guys have other questions on that same topic, that's totally fine as well. I've had my 36 ounces of coffee, so I'm feeling caffeinated.
Are European and like other world voters motivated by single issues like Americans are? Do they have an equivalent, I guess, of like NRA type voters or you know, abortion or like single issue? Do they tend to be more motivated by, I guess, broad philosophical views, or are they more motivated by
post-material issues as opposed to material issues?
Yeah,
yes, but they're not the same as, so in this country, you know, gun rights is, you know, or what I like to, you know, label the 3 Gs, you know, God, guns, and gays. Those are very prominent, you know, post-material issues for the right, whereas environmental and civil rights issues are kind of those post-material issues for the left. And you see a lot more of that, those left post-material issues resonating with voters in European democracies or, you know, democracies in Asia and Australasia as well. Because most other all other advanced industrialized countries have strictly limited gun ownership. We're the only advanced industrialized country that has a fully established and thriving gun culture. And has, I'm not exactly sure why that's the case, because you know, Australia was also a white settler colony as well as New Zealand, so they had a lot of the similar experiences that we had in terms of you know, manifest destiny and like moving and colonizing a rough frontier. But we're the only ones that really have a gun culture. So when you see those post-material issues in other advanced industrialized countries and democracies, it tends to be those kind of left post-material issues rather than, although increasingly I will say that with the refugee crisis, this has started to activate post-material issues on the right in terms of nationalism, right? This post-material idea of like who belongs, right? It gets back to that jus sanguinis conception, right? How do we define our community? And for the longest time, you know, we have the idea that nation states should be made up of similar people. Sorry, that's okay. It's not the first time that's ever happened. But, right, so most countries, especially in Europe, I would say a lot more so than the United States, there's the idea that there is a national culture, people who are unified by ethnicity, language, religion, shared history, right? If you're German, you're German. If you're French, you are French, right? We don't have that in this country because we are a polyglot nation of, you name it, right? We have it. Even in our earliest eras, we were predominantly European, but we were English, we were Irish, we were Italian, we were Dutch, we were Russian. I mean, you name it. We've always kind of been diverse, and so we don't have kind of that national identity like Europeans do. And so that's been activated, or I would say reactivated, with this refugee crisis, because all of a sudden you have hundreds of thousands of people with a different religion, with a different ethnicity, with a different history interacting, and that creates the potential for people to start questioning things on how do we define ourselves? Are we going to have to redefine ourselves in this light? And the fact is that Germany will now have to redefine itself because they've let in 1 million people, and so I think what you're going to see in the case of Germany is they're going to have to start. They are a nation state right now, but they are going to have to become more of a state nation, which is what we are right now, and that's different. That means you're going to have to redefine yourself along values as opposed to kind of physical characteristics and traits, which is how most societies define themselves. And this is a serious issue. Some states are willing to make life for themselves harder to maintain that national cohesion. A great example of this is Japan. After World War II, they were totally devastated. Their factories, their industrial heartland, just obliterated. Lost an entire generation of workers. So when they were reestablishing themselves, in the 1950s and 1960s, they needed to rebuild their economic base, right, to be prosperous. But they didn't have enough people to man the factories. And so what did they do? Well, you have to get immigrants to kind of work the factories, and they did that. They made it very easy for immigrants in South America, from Bolivia, from Peru, from Brazil, to come to Japan to man the factories because they just didn't have enough workers to do that. And that helped Japan kind of rebuild themselves. Now, whatever happened to those Portuguese and Peruvians in Japan?
They went home.
Well, that's one way to put it. They got kicked out, and they are being kicked out right now because 30, 40 years later, the Japanese are a very insular society. What it means to be a Japanese citizen is that you were born there. Again, that jus sanguinis conception, that you're ethnically Japanese, that you are religiously Japanese, that you engage in Shinto or respect Shinto, that you have a common language and history. And so now what they are doing, now that they are prosperous again, they're actually paying the people who came over back in the 1950s and 1960s sometimes as much as $30,000 to $35,000 to get the hell out. Now, that's bad for Japan's economy because they are an aging population, right? They're one of the oldest populations on the planet. Their population is shrinking. But they are still doing this. They are still kicking workers out who pay taxes, who allow the Japanese welfare system to actually take care of their aging population. They're getting rid of those people right now because they value national identity more than economic prosperity. And that's one of the advantages that the United States has in terms of economics, is that we are very, or at least were, very liberal in our immigration policies. That is a shot in the arm economically, because that means if we didn't have immigration, we would be facing the same kind of demographic problems as countries like Germany, Japan, and Italy. Our population is aging. When you are a more prosperous society, people have less kids. If you're not working on the farm, you don't need to have 5 kids to help you bring in the crop and to help take care of mom and dad when they're too old to do that stuff, right? Now we have working professionals where it doesn't make sense to have 5 kids anymore. You can't even afford to have 5 kids anymore, right? So naturally, when you have increased prosperity, the incentives for having a large family fall, which makes it harder to kind of support, social services and government services through taxation, because your tax base is shrinking. The only way to make sure that that tax base is big enough to kind of pay for everything from national security to social security is to have taxpayers. And so one way to do that with a shrinking population is to allow for immigration. But Japan has decided that no, we're not going to do that. We're going to actually shrink our tax base, make it harder for ourselves to kind of pay for basic government services, infrastructure, national security, because we value our national identity more than economic rationality. And that, in my mind, is the biggest kind of evidence against the idea that we are purely rational homo economicus. We are not.
That's really at the heart of the whole immigration debate in America. But
Well, it's very telling. Who supports immigration? Businesses.
Yeah.
Corporate America is all about immigration because, think about all those, janitorial jobs, agricultural jobs that white Americans don't want, right? There's a stigma attached to those type of jobs. Ask an American teenager, you want to spend your summer bringing in a tomato crop or something like that, where you're going to have to do back-breaking work from dawn to dusk, basically, rip up your hands and develop big calluses? No, that's just not going to happen. You could raise the amount of money, to $10 an hour, and you probably still wouldn't attract enough American white workers to do that, right? But Mexicans will, people from South America who have a much kind of lower, standard of living, are willing to do that type of backbreaking work. And this is why, corporations have been pushing both parties to, provide a pathway to citizenship, to not build a border wall, because their bottom line, their profitability really depends on having an unlimited access to labor, right? And if you take away immigration, then all of a sudden the American population would start to shrink, just like what is happening in Japan and Germany right now. And that would, we already have big fiscal problems being able to afford the things we want. That's going to get worse if we limit immigration, because that's limiting taxpayers. That's limiting kind of the employment base that you can have. It violates, Adam Smith's basic idea of, liberal economic theory, right? Labor and capital need to go where they're most productive. Unfortunately, national boundaries get in the way of having those national movements. It's easier for capital to move. You can send capital across the world through fiber optic cable, but labor does not have the same ability to move. We have hard and fast national borders that make it really difficult for labor to move. In a purely liberal economic system, if Adam Smith was able to create a system, people from all over the world would be able to move anywhere they wanted, wherever the jobs were. And that's what economic rationality would demand. This idea of national identity for someone like Adam Smith is garbage. It just gets in the way of human prosperity and progress.
I think a lot of the anti-immigration people think that they're being rational because they don't have a great understanding of economics. I think they picture jobs as this finite number of jobs. There's only
Like a
so
pie.
many of them. And so when an immigrant comes in and takes a job, they're necessarily taking a job away. It's, obviously it's contrary to Adam Smith and pretty much anybody that's taken an economics class, but I think that's how they picture it. Like it's a pie. This is the number of jobs that there are, and when they come in, they've taken one away from us.
Yeah.
So I think they are being, I think they think they're being rational.
and even beyond that, this popular notion that immigrants don't pay taxes
They do.
gets in but the number of people who think that, well, they don't pay taxes.
Well, what's really
They pay a lot of taxes.
what's really going to throw your mind through a loop is the fact that they pay more taxes than the 1% as a percentage of their income.
Oh, that doesn't surprise me at all. Yeah.
And as a percentage of their income, an undocumented worker probably pays more taxes proportionate to how much they make annually than Donald Trump does.
Well, kids just don't think about the fact, I mean, I think they think like, well, I have a job, I work at Burger King or Subway or whatever, and I pay taxes, but, you know, even an illegal, undocumented immigrant pays taxes.
Anytime
you
they
know,
buy anything,
excise
they pay
taxes,
taxes.
sales taxes, yeah, and they, well, you know, they didn't really think about that, but, and that in itself would be a tremendous financial hit to the country.
Yes, it would, definitely. And what's always kind of surprised me is that support amongst Americans for stricter immigration, it gets stronger the further they are away from the border and the further they are away from those type of diverse
Right.
communities, which, you know, think about that. Why is that the case that you have people in Iowa, that's where you find the biggest supporters for a wall on the Mexican border. Not people in Texas, not people
Yeah.
in Arizona, it's people in Iowa and in Montana.
They're not exposed to it. Hill City, I think our Mexican population right now is right around 20%, because the Mexican families come in and work the timber industry. The majority of the logging companies down around Hill City and the Black Hills are Mexican families. And I know a lot of the kids are illegal. They know it, they're very open about it. There's been law enforcement have come in and taken a few families out with stings. But yeah, we're very exposed to it in Hill City. And it's hard as a US history teacher to talk about immigration, because I have 20–25% of my kids, majority of are illegal.
Well, what's
Yeah.
fascinating also from a historical perspective is that a lot of those Mexicans, they were there before, right? We had something called the Mexican-American War in 1848, where California, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, that used to be Mexico. We conquered that. And those Mexicans, they lived there. That was their home, right? So, you know, when people, you know, talk about, you know, aliens or foreigners, well, I guess that depends, right? You know, a lot of times these are communities who have been here long before the United States even existed as a country. But what's also really interesting is in 2015, the Pew Research industry discovered a remarkable fact that immigration from Mexico has actually started to reverse itself. That from 1964 to 2015, there was a positive inflow of people from Mexico in search of jobs, right? But that's reversed itself, and now we have more Mexicans leaving the country than are coming in. And this is exactly at the time when we are building a border wall, when the problem is reversing itself. And you know, why is this taking place now? Well, it has a lot to do with the Great Recession of 2008 and the fact that there's just not nearly as many jobs as there used to be, and that was that pull factor that brought a lot of people here. Well, those jobs aren't here, you know, for the taking, so you're having a lot less people coming. But it's also the fact that, you know, people separate themselves from their families to come here, and a lot of people are returning to their families as well. And so, you know, we are in a time of kind of hysteria about Mexican immigration. But when you actually look at the numbers, this hysteria is taking place during a time when net migration is reversing itself and more are leaving than are coming in. And that's just another one of those paradoxes of political science where, again, kind of demonstrating that we are not nearly as rational as we hope or think that we are.
What do you think is driving the issue? I don't ever remember. I've followed politics and elections closely ever since I've been a kid. I don't ever remember it really being much of a campaign issue until this year. You'd hear people mention it, but I guess I don't ever remember large numbers of people voting based on immigration policy or have a wall. Why now?
Well, because you had a candidate that was making that a very prominent issue, right? And making, you know, a lot of outlandish claims. You know, these people are rapists. You know, these people are drug dealers. They're criminals, right? That's, you know, when political scientists, you know, call Donald Trump a demagogue, it's because he's, you know, meeting that definitional criteria. Appealing.
So he's whipping it up. It isn't people like, you know what, I'm sick of this. Let's
Well, again,
he's whipping it up.
That's hard to kind of explain when you have
Yeah.
massive support for a border wall in Iowa, which has, you know, one of the lowest
Yeah.
percentages of Mexican Americans in the entire country. So here you have a community that has no Mexicans. You know, there are no Mexicans there. They don't really deal with this issue on a day-to-day basis, but yet these are the people who are most supportive of a border wall. I mean, how does that make sense? I mean, where are they getting this idea that this is a problem, that a lot of the problems of the country are
Yeah.
because of illegal immigration? You know, it makes sense if, you know, you had, you know, where are a lot of, you know, Mexican Americans or undocumented Mexicans? They're in LA, they're in Chicago, they're in New York, they're in the big urban centers, because that's where most of the jobs are, right? But these are the areas where you don't have people clamoring for a border wall or anything like that, right? It's in the areas where, you know, there is no interaction really, and that, in my mind, kind of leads to the argument, well, it really must be because, you know, prominent politicians are activating this issue in the minds of people, right? And saying, you know, you can never go wrong appealing to the lowest common denominator, and we have a long history of racism in this country, right? You know, a country that was founded with the institution of slavery. And so it's easy to kind of activate that kind of perspective in the American body politic. It's always kind of there lurking underneath the surface, ready to be activated.
I think you can see the same thing with jobs. I mean, I think there he's promised all kinds of movement on, you know, I mean, maybe some of those jobs moved overseas, mostly because it was cheaper labor, you know, and then you bump up against the responsibility of those corporations to, you know, increase the value of the stock to their stockholders for, you know. I mean, like, you know, his whole thing with coal and, you know, coal's biggest problem is natural gas is cheap.
Yeah.
He's promising all these people, he's promising the good old days. I'm going to bring back the 1950s. It just isn't going to happen. You know, those jobs aren't there to come back. A lot of them have been lost to automation, or, you know.
I guess.
But that doesn't stop people from
No.
going, that guy, somebody
Yeah.
must be screwing me over. I'm voting for this guy. You know, that's.
You're
right.
used to Republican economics, though.
Yeah.
It's like completely at odds with, you know, with a lot of traditional Republican, you know, they're for free trade.
They used to be.
NAFTA used to be.
The TPP, the
mean,
Republicans,
yeah.
you know, conventional Republicans love the Trans-Pacific
Yeah, the
Partnership.
anti-trade people used to be like hippies and stuff in Seattle, and now it seems, yeah.
You're right.
It's kind of weird. It's not the Republican economics. He's like more free market.
Well, that's why there's a growing disconnect between Donald Trump and regular Republicans, because the Republican Party has historically been, at least since, you know, the early 20th century, the party of business. You know, very business-friendly policies, right? The idea that as long as businesses are successful, the country is going to be successful. But you're absolutely right. Donald Trump is speaking in a much more populist, kind of economic protectionist manner, talking about putting tariffs on, you know,
Yeah.
imports from Mexico and China.
Yeah.
You know, that's a big
Yeah.
departure for the Republicans, especially,
Oh,
and
yes.
would have much, and from a historical perspective, been much more closely associated with a Democratic, you know, position, because the Democrats have historically been the party of labor, the party that was much more interested in protecting domestic industries from foreign competition. But now you have a big role reversal taking place, and all of a sudden, Republicans are a lot more critical of free trade. You know, Trump, one of the first things he did in office was end the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal, which, you know, had been negotiated over the course of half a decade, you know, with 12 plus different countries, which would have been great for consumers, right? So, you know, why is free trade good? Well, look at all the, you know, clothes that we're wearing right now. You know, a lot of the times you can get like a shirt for like $12. You can get a pair of pants for like 25, 35 bucks, right? It didn't used to be that way. You know, back in the 1940s and 1930s, you know, the cost of labor in this country, stuff that was made here, is jacked that price up. So consumers benefit from free trade, but producers don't, right? they kind of, it's more competition for them, it's hard for them to make a profit. But there's no constituency for consumers. We're not organized amongst ourselves. You guys reaching saturation point?
How about, I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about nuclear proliferation, just given what's going on in Korean Peninsula and.
Yeah, well, you know, we went from us having a nuclear monopoly during World War II to, 9 states currently have nuclear weapons, and we've tried to halt the proliferation of nuclear weapons. We've had treaties, most famously in 1968, we signed helped create the NPT Treaty, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, in which we would, all signatories of this treaty agreed to not pursue, the development of nuclear weapons technology in exchange for gaining access to nuclear power and the use of, nuclear technology in medicine. So, radiation treatments for chemotherapy and stuff like that. And the nuclear powers, Russia, France, UK, United States, were supposed to get rid of their stockpile of weapons. Well, we haven't done that right now. And so slowly but surely, the number of countries that have gained access to nuclear weapons is increasing. And it's easier to develop nuclear technology these days, right? It's no longer the 1940s. Even a medium-sized country has the technological base now to kind of pursue, nuclear technology. Now, I think the concern is that, during the Cold War, we had the states that had nuclear technology were major powers, right? And these were pretty wealthy states, fairly stable states. And they adhered to the logic of deterrence, right? And deterrence is a fancy word for saying creating in the mind of the enemy the fear to attack, right? Everyone kind of recognizes the destructive power of nuclear weapons. And even in Russia and the United States and France, they realized that if they were to use nuclear weapons on one country, that they were going to be struck in kind and that no one would win, that we would all be mutually obliterated, right? This led to the doctrine of MAD, mutually assured destruction, which basically means that you can't use nuclear weapons. What's really problematic now is that we have a lot of smaller countries, a lot less stable countries that have nuclear weapons. And so Israel now has nuclear weapons, Pakistan has nuclear weapons, North Korea has nuclear weapons, Iran was pursuing nuclear weapons and still has the capability, if it wanted to develop them. And it's less clear for us on whether or not these leaders are strictly rational, right? That they recognize the logic of deterrence, of mutually assured destruction. So it's unclear, North Korea, this is a country that has been deteriorating economically for several decades. This is a country where they had massive periodic famines throughout the 1990s. The regime does not seem to kind of operate on a similar basis than most other countries. It's unclear to us if Kim Jong-un is going to still operate like, Nikita Khrushchev or Brezhnev did, even though we had differences. So, yeah, it's easier for nuclear technology to spread now, and the types of countries that are getting it are less stable. Pakistan, right? Pakistan is a large country, 160 plus million people, and it's a weak state. It does not have control over its population and territory. So you have Baluchistan province, which has very little government presence and control over the people. There's been a slow-burning insurgent movement amongst the Baluchistanis against the Pakistani central government. The same thing's happening in the federally administered tribal region. In the northwestern province region, you have a Taliban insurgency that's going on. So you have a country that has nuclear weapons that can't control the population within its territory. And so the concern is that, well, what happens if a group not connected to the government were to attack or raid a government facility that had nuclear weapons, right? Well, we don't know, but it doesn't seem like it would be good. So, this is kind of where we are at now. The nuclear club is not major powers anymore. It's small, weak, unstable states, and it's unclear if they are going to be acting rationally or even have an incentive to. So, Kim Jong-il, he might have an incentive to be crazy, right? That's the only way that he can gain, concessions from the United States or from China, right? Act like a crazy person, and people will be too terrified, and they'll acquiesce to what you want. And this has kind of been the story of U.S.-North Korean relations going back to the George H.W. Administration. We've tried to periodically negotiate with them. During the Clinton administration, we struck a deal with them where we would provide light nuclear reactors to give them access to nuclear power in exchange for halting a weapons program. But that ultimately didn't work. During the George W. Bush administration and the Obama administration, we basically refused to talk to them. And that doesn't seem to have worked as well. Now they have already developed nuclear technology. They tested their first weapon in 2006, and I think they've tested a total of 5 weapons. They still don't have the ballistic missile technology that is required to place that weapon in a place of their choosing, but they're getting close. So, anytime a country can put a satellite into orbit, that means that they can also put a nuclear weapon in orbit. And so that's kind of what we're really concerned about. The first time that they have an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile that can penetrate Earth's atmosphere and go ballistic, that means that they can hit anywhere in the world. And that's what we're dealing with right now. We have a U.S. carrier attack group that is steaming towards the Korean Peninsula as we speak. We have the 105th anniversary of the North Korean regime. I was looking on the BBC today. They had massive military parades parading their new missiles, the ones that supposedly do have the capability to reach at least the West Coast. And so these are dangerous times. There's the University of Chicago has what's called the Doomsday Clock. It's a metaphorical clock, and a group of scientists basically tell us how close humanity is to Armageddon, of rendering our planet uninhabitable. And we are at the closest point that it's ever been. Even during the worst points of the Cold War, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we are now 2.5 minutes to midnight. That's how concerned educated people are about the prospects for a nuclear confrontation today. That tells you something when people are more concerned today than they were during the height of the Cold War about the potential for a nuclear exchange. Talk to your parents. They'll remember duck and cover drills. People building fallout shelters in their backyard, stocking them with food and water. I mean, the Cold War was hot for a lot of people during its time, and now I think Americans have lulled themselves into a false sense of security where we don't really, we don't have an evil empire like the Soviet Union to kind of focus our minds on this. It's some small backwards country, where most Americans probably would have difficulty locating it on a map, and it's like we don't have that kind of existential, I think, threat level today. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. We've kind of become numb to the prospect of a nuclear exchange. And this is all coinciding with something that is really hard to explain. Raise your hand if you think we live in a more peaceful environment than 50 years ago. None of you? You're all wrong. This is actually the most peaceful era of human history. Conflict within states and between states has been precipitously declining since the end of World War II. And so we don't know that, I think, because remember our discussion on media, bias, selection bias. If you watched, especially the 24/7 news, what you're going to be confronted with is war, and conflict, and that magnifies the sense of conflict out there. But when you compare the amount of people killed in wars and the number of wars from today to 50 years ago, it's rock bottom. We actually live in arguably the most peaceful era of human history, which I think makes nuclear proliferation even more dangerous, because I think we've lulled ourselves into this false sense of security where we're not anticipating, we're not kind of looking out or on the lookout for a nuclear war, because why should we? you know, this country, we haven't fought, there hasn't been a war between major powers since World War II. And that's the kind of wars you want to avoid, because yes, we have wars today, but thousands of people die in the wars that we have today. When you had wars between major powers, you had tens of millions of people dying, and that's a big difference. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
I was just watching the thing on the Somme during World War I, and July 1st, the first day of the attack, there was 60,000 casualties within the first couple of, before noon of that day.
That was one battle.
And that was one battle.
In the Vietnam War, which after Afghanistan is our longest war, we had about 58 to 60,000 casualties in total, and that was a
Right.
war that took place over the span of a decade.
Right.
And what you're talking about is industrial war between major powers, and that's a different animal between the wars that we have today, which are nasty, no doubt, but in terms of the destructive power brought to bear, it's far less than what it was, even in World War I, when military technology was crude by modern standards. Yeah, the American Experience show?
Yeah.
I have to watch that.
Well, I just saw
Christopher
something on
Cantz said that
Netflix. It was on the Somme, and they talked about, and they just highlighted day one, and they said, and now think it went from July 1st to November, and the destruction was, you know,
It was
hundreds
about
of
a million, wasn't it?
Yeah,
Like pretty
like when
close to a
it's got-
million casualties total over the course of the whole offensive.
Right.
They
It was
gained about
brutal.
300 yards of
Yeah.
ground.
It's hard for the modern mind to wrap your mind around casualty numbers like that. At that point, it becomes just a statistic, right?
How'd they keep getting people to go do that? At
Well,
some point.
it became increasingly hard.
I
Eventually,
would've
the
said,
French
"I'm not
army
going."
mutinied, and so
I'd say,
the
"Throw
German
me
army
in."
threatened to mutiny. The Russians,
Yeah.
the Russians had a Bolshevik revolution because
Yeah.
people were no longer willing to, you know, go into the meat grinder of the, you know, the Eastern Front.
Yeah.
So, you know, there's a reason why the Allies were desperate for the Americans to come in, because at that point in the war, the Brits, the French, everyone was done.
Yeah.
And they were facing, you know, that's why you had, you know, the Christmas truce, the famous Christmas truce, you know, where you had a moment of clarity, if you will, where on Christmas Eve you had Germans and French and Brits, you know, meeting each other in no man's land and celebrating. You know, they went back to killing each other the very next day, but, you know, that could not have been sustained indefinitely, right? You know, both armies on all sides were on the verge of mutiny before, you know, the U.S. came in and injected, you know, a fresh shot of several hundred thousand soldiers who, you know, hadn't been in the meat grinder yet, and that really made a symbolic and real material difference.
It's amazing that democratic countries, too, are more democratic, like France and Britain. I mean, Germany had a dictator, so it's a little bit easier, I think, to get people to go.
Well, it helps when
or
you're
die.
being invaded.
But yeah, that's true. That's true.
So, you know, that tends
Yeah.
to, you know, stir the national passions
Yeah.
if you're invaded. And so, you know, Germany was definitely, you're right, Kaiser Wilhelm was a dictator, one of the biggest jerks of human history, I would let's say. But yeah, you know, the French were able to, you know, it matters when the war's on your home,
That's true.
on your home front.
Yeah.
And democracies tend to win the wars that they fight, and a lot of the times that's because political leadership will pay a big price if they don't win and dedicate every single resource they can to winning it, which is kind of hard to square with the fact that the U.S. hasn't won a war since World War II, or since World War II, actually.
We also haven't declared
Well,
war since.
Congress hasn't declared
No,
war.
Congress hasn't declared war.
Which,
Yeah,
according to the Constitution,
yes.
they're supposed to do. What are you guys thinking? Talk a little bit, I guess, about you know, realpolitik versus liberal internationalism. And you know, I'm sure this is a country we've been perpetually at war since 9/11, right? To your students, do they ever ask questions about, you know, the military involvements of why we're in Afghanistan or why we're in Iraq or anything like that?
Not anymore. Used to, but it's just the way it is now.
It's kind of dissipated, yeah.
They've lived their whole life there, so yeah, not anymore. When it first started, yes, all the time.
Did they ask any questions about, you know, Trump recently launching 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles against Syria?
Yes.
What do you guys say?
Well, if you look at what the right hand's doing, you won't notice what's in the left.
A wag the dog scenario? Well, where does that come down in realpolitik and liberal internationalism? You know, strangely enough, you know, Donald Trump, he's a Republican, right? So you would not associate a Republican president, at least immediately, with liberal internationalism, but that action falls within that school of thought. Liberal internationalism, again, goes back to Woodrow Wilson, which was basically, you know, he was famous for making that statement, the world must be made safe for democracy, right? That was really a revolutionary redefining of the American national interest when it came to foreign policy, because it really, for the first time, made us look outwards, and it gave us a sense of responsibility, that we were responsible to a certain extent about the things that happened in other countries. And this has developed so far that there is now what is called a responsibility to protect principle, and that American presidents increasingly feel like, you know, if a vulnerable population in a different country is being abused by its government, that we somehow have a responsibility as fellow humans to protect them, right? Now that's very different from a realpolitik standpoint. A realpolitik believes that the national interest should be very narrowly defined. And so when you're talking about thinkers who adopted this type of mindset, you should be thinking about Machiavelli, you should be thinking about you know, Otto von Bismarck, people like this. And these were people who thought that the national interest should be all about the state, focused on the state, right? That it's the duty of the state to protect its territorial integrity, its population, and its political and economic institutions. And that's it. You know, if some dictator is, you know, gassing his population, that's their business, and we really have no skin in the game. We have no justification to be doing that, because we live in a system of sovereign states, right? All states are sovereign. That means that they get to determine the rules that govern their society without being told what to do by foreigners, right? But liberal internationalism questions that. It says that no, sovereignty is not a you know, a foolproof shield, that states are not fully able to decide what they do in their society, that there is something called the international community, and that those with great power have great responsibility to uphold those kind of measures of civilization, right? Now, when do you choose to kind of act on that, and when do you don't? When is it in the national interest, or does the national interest even have any meaning anymore for that? So, you know, as a thought experiment, should the U.S. have fought a war against Nazi Germany to help save the Jews? Should we have intervened in Turkey when they committed genocide against their Armenian minority? Should we, in the 1990s, have gotten involved in Rwanda when you had a bunch of Hutus massacring the Tutsi minority with machetes? Should we invade North Korea because the regime there is so terrible that their population is starving, and you know, a third of their people live in work camps, right? You know, where do you draw the line? You know, how do you navigate between realpolitik and liberal internationalism? That's a you know, question that's always up for debate, and I don't think we have any good answers. You know, strangely enough, you know, Barack Obama, he really kind of adhered much closer to the realpolitik level than the liberal internationalism level. He tried desperately to pull us out of Iraq. Didn't succeed because we were just totally committed there. Tried to reduce our numbers in Afghanistan. That didn't work either. Resisted calls to put troops on the ground in Libya and in Syria, but yet we are still there with a military presence. So it's hard to kind of, this gets to that issue of the military-industrial complex. You know, the fact that we spend on any annual basis as much as $500 billion or more on the military. Now, when you make that type of investment, almost $1 trillion on the military, you're going to have a lot of incentives, or at least a lot of compulsion to use it. Because If you're not using it, how can you justify spending that much money? And for the country with the $600+ billion hammer, all of a sudden, the problems that you're confronting are gonna start looking like nails, right? You're gonna have to justify spending that much money. Otherwise, think about this. If we never used the military, it would be a lot harder for politicians to kind of make the case for spending almost $1 trillion of national income on an annual basis on the military. Why spend that much money on something you're not using, right? But if you're using it, then it kind of makes sense. And so, this is President Eisenhower famously warned the country when he left office. You can Google this. They have this tape on YouTube where he explicitly warned Americans against the growing power of what he called the military-industrial complex. And now, what is that? That's kind of this ambiguous, nefarious-sounding term. What it simply means is that there's strong relationships that have developed ever since World War II, when we kind of switched our economy from producing consumer goods to military goods. There was strong relationships created between business and the military, right? And that these relationships have become self-sustaining, right? That certain businesses, think of Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, any type of business that builds anything for the Department of Defense, they want to keep those relationships, right? They want to still be profitable. They still want to be making these things, and so there's this, bureaucratic incentive to kind of be pressuring politicians to, make sure that they are funding, military weapons procurement, especially in their districts, right? And so it's really hard to kind of transition back to a peacetime economy. We've never really done that. We demobilized a little bit after the end of the Cold War, but especially when 9/11 happened, we're right back to kind of where we were started. And when you look at how much we spend on the military, it's really quite amazing. We spend more on the military in any given year than China, Russia, Germany, Japan, Italy, Canada, Australia combined. Not just individually. Take all those 7 countries and their annual military spending, combine them, and they still spend less, and a lot less, hundreds of billion, like more than $100 billion less than we do on defense. And that's kind of hard to square, if you're kind of thinking about it. And I'm not some type of I'm not a pacifist. I come from a long line of, I'm a military family. I'm an Army brat myself. I think I'm the first person in my family that didn't join the armed forces. So I'm not just automatically against the military, but and the reason why my family is middle class has a lot to do with the military. It's really kind of an avenue to the middle class for a lot of Americans, I think. But at some point, we got to ask ourselves: is this, what can't we focus on? What can't we spend money on? We have opportunity costs that are being made. $1 billion you spend on, an order of Tomahawk missiles. That's $1 billion you're not spending on updating, infrastructure that's 50 years old. That's $50 billion that you're not spending on education, healthcare, research and development for the technologies of the future. I mean, we are making decisions right now. And if you look at, there's a famous historian, Paul Kennedy, you're probably familiar with them. He was a historian interested on the rise and fall of major powers. And so he spent his entire career looking at, why do major powers collapse upon themselves? And it's simple. They overextend themselves militarily, and they spend too much on the military to the point where it starts cannibalizing their own economy. That's how Rome fell. That's how the Empire of Japan fell. That's how Nazi Germany fell. That's how the British Empire started to deteriorate, overextended itself. Remember the very famous phrase, "The sun did not set on the British Empire." Well, that was costly to maintain, and that came at an expense of the economic vitality that allowed them to build a world-class navy in the first place. And so, Paul Kennedy has been sounding the alarm since the late 1980s that, we are spending way too much on the military. We are committing ourselves to military engagements, abroad, way too much. It's undercutting what it's going to take to kind of keep ourselves at the level of development that we have. And if you've ever seen a footprint of how many countries we have, or military bases we have in the country, can you? Yeah, I can. There's a couple interesting sites. Oh, this will go away. One site, let's see, the National Priorities Project. That these are good resources for classrooms. It basically shows, you know, where on an annual basis our tax dollars go.
What do you want me to
National
Google?
priorities.
National priorities?
Yes. And priorities. I think it's, yeah, hit that.
Here?
Yep. Let's see, go down.
Actually, it's a touch screen. You can.
Oh. Excellent. Oh, that's nice. Let's see.
Do you know the breakdown in military spending? How much of it is on stuff like veterans benefits, caring for the disabled, and how
Yeah, I
much
don't know
of it
if
is
this site
guns
does
and
that type of
bombs?
fine grain. This is more kind of a broad macro perspective. You could find that information, you'd have to do a little bit
Yeah.
more digging though. But this is a great website, the National Priorities Project. They just break everything down and it shows you what we value as a society, right? Look at education, 6%. Government, 7%. Medicare and health, 6%. You know, when you, and science, 3%, you know, developing the technologies of the future, you know, we don't seem to really be preparing for the future at all. Transportation, 2%. I mean, a lot of our infrastructure is from the New Deal era. It's falling apart. You know, it's a testament to how good the infrastructure was that it's still with us and lasting, but it's not gonna last forever. But this is, you know, this kind of gives you an idea of where the national priority is, right? And that reflects, I think, more than anything else, the power of the military-industrial complex is that it commands so much of our national resources. How do I get out of this again?
Let's see if I just go
Actually,
back.
let's see, I wanted to see, how do you, oh, I don't have a keyboard. So, let's see, I want to find.
You want me to Google something else?
Yes.
Okay.
U.S. military footprint, map of U.S. military footprint, see what comes up. Okay, these are old.
Okay. Let me try.
And yeah, maybe not do images, do all. We want to get to a site here. Here, actually, Wikipedia does have a halfway decent map that I've used before.
Down here? Okay.
Yeah. Oh, actually global, and go back, this is national. So, in the Google bar,
Oh.
US military bases, global maybe, around the world. Let's see here. How about this one, the worldwide network of, yeah. Oh, can't get, oh, that's one of them. Here, again, that's an old one. This is outdated. We actually have more than this, but you get the idea. We have more military installations in other countries than any other country throughout human history, more than the Roman Empire did, more than the British Empire did. You know, we have 30,000 troops stationed in Korea, we have 50,000 troops stationed in Japan, we have about 50,000 troops in Germany, we have troops in the United Kingdom, in Italy, in Australia, in Djibouti, in the Horn of Africa, we have them in Syria, in Iraq, and Afghanistan, and I mean, you guys can kind of get the idea here. You know, we are very much garrisoning the world. There, that's a good one, yes. So this gives you an idea that approximately half the countries of the world have some type of US military presence in them, right? Now think about that. How do you think you would feel if in Spearfish we had a Chinese military base right across the street, or a German military base right across the street. It's not immediately clear what you would think about that.
Yeah, that is very strange. Don't you think people view the military spending somewhat like that catastrophe insurance policy?
I think so.
You know what I mean?
And I think most Americans have no idea the extent of the military presence abroad. And I think they really don't have a good idea of how much money we spend on the military. And, I teach a lot of, international political economy. And when I ask students, how much do you think the United States gives as a percentage of, national income to foreign aid? A lot of times students will be like, oh, maybe 6% or 5%. The actual number is 0.02% of gross national income. So I think Americans in general just have are pretty ignorant about, where tax dollars go and what it is actually spent on. I think a lot of Americans have erroneous ideas of how much we spend on welfare programs, right? I think they don't realize that the amount of Americans on food assistance and unemployment has actually fallen since the 1990s. It's less than what it used to be. It's getting less and less all the time, and it's not because we have food insecurity isn't an issue anymore, unemployment isn't an issue anymore. It's just that we've been cutting those policies over and over and over again, and we also have erroneous ideas on who receives these types of benefits as well. So, a lot of times in unguarded moments, you ask, who are the primary recipients of, welfare services? Minorities, right? That's incorrect. The vast majority of people who receive welfare benefits are single white moms. That's the largest, group, and white people in total, in aggregate, are the largest numbers. Now, as a percentage, disproportionate representation is within, minority groups, but in total numbers, when we're talking about who receives these benefits, it's white Americans, and disproportionately it's single moms as well. And that makes sense, right? Because, a single mom raising a kid on her own is going to need assistance. They can't work a full-time job and raise their kids on their own. And that's why, a lot of people, remember welfare to work in the 1990s. This was a Bill Clinton initiative where he had Republican support, where basically, in order to receive welfare benefits, you had to have a job. What kind of jobs are these people going to get? They're going to get minimum wage jobs that are not in their community, that are in wealthier communities, and so think about the type of impact that has on families. It's no coincidence that after welfare to work, you have not only welfare rolls fall, but not because people didn't need assistance. You also had an increase in poverty levels and extreme poverty levels as well. But Americans don't know that. We have this kind of narrative that if you're on welfare, it's because you're lazy, you lack initiative, you deserve your position in life, right? And I think that goes back to we have this narrative of ourselves as rugged individuals, right? That you succeed if you work hard, and that's the sole criteria. As long as you work hard, you can make it in the United States. That sounds appealing, and I think everyone wants that to be true, but it's not. Step out again, but I'll be back.
We're going to have to wrap it up.